Society Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Bernie Furshpan of Ordinary Heroes here at hmTV at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Today, I'm going to be featuring a very special guest. I look very much forward to having this discussion with Mr. Alan Govenar, who will have a conversation with me about the power of storytelling, preserving cultural memory, and giving voice to communities too often left out of history. He is a writer, a filmmaker, a photographer. Alan, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. It sounds like you do a lot of interesting work.
I've done a lot of interesting work. I don't know if I'm winding down. There's always something next for me, and I never know what it is. Doors just keep opening, and I just walk right through. Some people say, you're retired. Why don't you just take it easy? But you and I don't think we understand what that word means, retired. I think we're just rewired, if anything.
Well, I have always worked for myself. I started my first book when I was 17. It was a collection of poems. I started my first novel at 18, and that novel took a lot of transmutations over the years and was finally published last spring, 52 years later.
Wow.
But mainly I've written nonfiction books. I write poetry, I write plays, I work in musical theater. I started an organization called Documentary Arts in 1985 to broaden public knowledge and appreciation of the arts of different cultures in all media. And Documentary Arts is an organization for which I have never been a full-time executive director. Everything that Documentary Arts has done over the last 40 years is project-driven. And it's the subject matter that determines the media in which it comes to life. And then sometimes it comes to life in many different forms.
Alan, tell me, after more than 4 decades, you've been involved with this, of documenting untold stories of America. What first drew you to become a storyteller for the voices that others were overlooked?
My interest as a storyteller, I think, began when I was a child, growing up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, at a time in the 1950s when the social demographics of my neighborhood were changing. I lived in an area of Boston where 80% of the Jewish population of that area were concentrated. And during the course of my early childhood, there was a great deal of interracial tension. My father, who had aspired to be a writer, World War II came. He never became a writer. He was a journalist when he was, between the ages of 18 and 21. And he worked a lot of jobs that he didn't really like to support his family. He never wanted his children to have college loans. He worked 5.5 days a week, and he was a tireless volunteer. And he was very active in interfaith work. He was very active in the Boy Scouts. He was very active in trying to help first-time juvenile offenders. And so I lived in a world that was ripe with stories. It was a world that I barely understood. It was an area where people on the street corners were speaking languages I didn't understand, from Yiddish to Polish to Russian. And we moved from there in 1959 to a place called Marblehead, which was, or is, about 20 miles northeast of Boston, a very different world than where I had grown up. So I was always interested in knowing more about people who were different than me. And I guess I learned from my father that so much of the kind of bigotry that existed in the world was a result of the lack of understanding of others. And that theme has been pervasive in my work and has taken a lot of different forms. From this new film of mine, Quiet Voices in a Noisy World, A Struggle for Change in Jasper, Texas, to my musical, Texas in Paris, that will be at Signature Theater between January and the end of March in 2027. I've devoted my life to trying to give voice to the voiceless.
The power of storytelling matters more today than ever. It's so important that we tell these stories, and you challenge the dominant narratives by amplifying these overlooked voices. So let me ask you a question about the everyday individuals in Jasper, Texas, who were preserving the truth and pushing for justice without recognition. How did you accomplish that through your film?
When I founded Documentary Arts in 1985, I had finished my PhD a year earlier at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I got a commission from the Dallas Museum of Art to do a project called Living Texas Blues, which was to do a series of 3 short films, a small book, and an anthology of recordings related to blues music. But this was commissioned as part of a painting exhibition called Lone Star Regionalism. And it was about how the regionalism of Texas was beginning to get national acclaim in the 1930s that paralleled the growth of a Texas style of blues music. And in the course of doing that project, I began researching Black photographers. And there were 2 notable curators from 2 major institutions in Texas who were doing a 2-volume history of Texas photography. And when I talked to them and asked them about Black photographers who were represented in their work, they said there were none because their charge could only enable them to focus on photographers in existing collections, which meant that in 1984, there were apparently no known Black photographers in Texas collections. Now, since then, of course, I've learned that there were some, but I was enraged, and it motivated me to want to document these photographers. I mean, Texas was a place I'd been, interested in African American culture since I was a child. I grew up in a mixed world. I had a socially progressive father and mother. My first music that I heard on record was Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Sarah Vaughan, music my father listened to. So for me, this had great appeal. And at that time, very little was written about Texas blues as a regional style. And the work of Black photographers, I felt, was crucial to what I was doing. And the Dallas Museum of Art published my book, released my films, the anthology, and they were going to continue my work in Black photography, but the economy bottomed out in 1985, and I decided to found an organization called Documentary Arts and began researching Black photographers through business directories. In Texas, there were 110 different Black newspapers that had published, little community newspapers and urban-based newspapers. And I started tracking down photographers through business directories. And many of the people I met were in their 70s and 80s. And they were photographers who were struggling. They were getting rid of their collections because many people didn't consider them important. And I started collecting their work. And my first work was on a Houston Black photographer, Benny Joseph. And he became the subject of a book that I did called The Early Years of Rhythm and Blues. And through Benny, I met a network of Black photographers. He had studied with a photographer, an itinerant photographer who had a school for Black photographers in Houston in 1910. And through word of mouth and through Benny's introductions, I started meeting different people. By the time I met my wife, artist Khalida Doolin, in 1988, my work had been advancing rather quickly, and Khalida was very interested in this. I was from Boston. She was from Texas, and these images I'd never seen because these photographs weren't published in mainstream white newspapers in Texas. And I began organizing other exhibitions. Initially, there was a lot of pushback because these were photographers that I called community photographers. They were photographers who oftentimes were not professionals per se. They may have done segregated school photography in neighborhood churches and the like, but their main profession may have been school teacher. I mean, there was one photographer in Lubbock. He was a janitor during the day, a porter at the bus station at night, and a photographer in between, photographing his community and the self-esteem of people in his world. And so in the early 1990s, my book on Benny Joseph was published, and it was featured in the Sunday New York Times. And that gave much more credibility to the work that I was doing. And I began collecting through documentary arts more photographs, and the collection was growing. And I put together a committee of different curators and other people who recognized this need. And I was urged by the state archivist to create an independent archive. And in 1995, Khalida Doolin and I founded the Texas African American Photography Archive. And we became one of the few independent archives in the country to receive funding from the National Archives in Washington for 3.5 years. We had a full-time certified archivist. And the last part of this funding from the National Archive supported us to create what we called a regional archivist position that enabled us to work in historically Black colleges in Texas. And one of those colleges, Wiley College, which was the oldest Black college west of the Mississippi. We were doing an internship program with students there. I was working with a Black history professor, Lloyd Thompson, and his wife, Bertha Thompson, was a school teacher in Jasper, Texas, which I had never been to. I'd travel around the state, but this is a little town in the deep piney woods of East Texas. And she knew the widow of a photographer, Alonzo Jordan. And Alonzo Jordan had been the Black barber in town. He was an elder in his church. He was a Sunday school teacher. He was a consummate professional in many different areas and a role model for people in his community. And he had died in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, shortly before I got there, a hurricane had come through that part of Texas, and it ripped the roof of his barbershop, which had been his studio. And I met with his widow and through Mrs. Thompson, and she decided to gift what could be saved of her husband's work to our Texas African American Photography Archive. Well, 2 years later, there was the terrible lynching of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper that threw Jasper into a national spotlight, where an African American man was picked up in town by 3 white men. They were drinking. They chained him to the back of a pickup truck and dragged him down a country road until he was decapitated and killed. And it this case was the first time in the history of Texas where anyone who was white was given the death penalty for killing someone that was black. And that led to exhibitions of the work of Alonzo Jordan, which didn't focus on this. Alonzo Jordan's work obviously existed prior to all this happening and focused on the dignity of his community. And I felt that the national coverage of this horrific lynching didn't quite tell the full story. And so I organized exhibitions of Alonzo Jordan's work. In 2010, I got a Guggenheim Fellowship to do this book and exhibition related to Mr. Jordan's photography at the International Center of Photography in New York. And this became a very important part of our collection. And over the years, I've stayed in touch with this community. When my book was published on Alonzo Jordan in 2011, the Alumni Association of a segregated school in Jasper bought 300 copies and they sent them nationwide. At that point, we knew about 5% of the people in these photographs. They sent back a spreadsheet with 95% of the people identified. And I got to know the people better and was very impressed by the way in which these elders in the Black community in their 70s and 80s were tireless volunteers wanting to reclaim their own history and to turn the corner from the trauma that their community had endured and was still living through. Healing is, after a lynching, is a very slow process. And as I started filming these individuals, they were putting up roadside markers. They restored 2 Rosenwald schools. I don't know if you're familiar with Rosenwald schools, but these were one-room schoolhouses that were funded by a Jewish philanthropist, Julius Rosenwald, working in partnership with Booker T. Washington. And there were 5,000 of these that were built around the South because there was no formal education available to so many Blacks in rural areas. And they had restored 2 of these buildings. They built little museums. They started a scholarship fund for kids in their community. And I was just so impressed. And that's what led to me making this movie. That while this movie has the backdrop of this lynching and then other lynchings that had occurred in that part of Texas in the early years of the 20th century, but it's a movie about healing and the power of individuals to take control of their own destiny by changing the narrative, by reclaiming their identity. So for me, what's happened in Jasper, Texas is a model for what should be happening all around our country, because we're faced in these terrible times with, among other things, the politics of erasure, the rewriting of history. How do we tell this story and who has the right to tell it? That's one of the big questions, I think, of our time.
It's a great point you make. It's a moral obligation to tell these stories. Erasure is also happening with other genocides besides the Holocaust. And lynching in that particular part of this country in the Deep South was very commonplace. Were these perpetrators ultimately executed by the state of Texas?
2 were given the death penalty, and 1 was given life in prison without parole. Mm-hmm. In my movie, there's an individual who was from this community. I mean, where this man was dragged and murdered, it's called Huff Creek. It was a freedom colony. And freedom colonies were enclaves of freed slaves, runaway slaves. And there was one individual who was from that community who knew the driver of the pickup truck. And it totally blindsided him. And he basically, he was a young guy. And the person in the movie talks about how he, just was so unprepared to see that he could succumb to this, participating in this lynching. But because of his testimony, the person was not given the death penalty.
I find this to be the case in many instances where art sort of meets responsibility. So where do we draw a line between you as a filmmaker and you as an activist? Or should there be a line? It's kind of blurry.
It's not blurry. For me, it's very clear. I am one and the same in whatever medium I'm working in.
I see.
So, for example, I write poetry every day. They're not always finished. They often are revised. But I've been writing poems since I was 17. And my poems are spare. They're about the passage of moments in time and how our thinking, our feeling, our beliefs can evolve in an instant. My novels explore the deeper psychology, I think, of areas of trauma and how do we overcome trauma. And my musical theater productions also focus on these themes. The musical of mine, Texas in Paris, that will be at Signature Theater January to March 2027, is about, it's a two-person musical. And I wrote this after the killing of Trayvon Martin, after Ferguson, Missouri, and the inordinate number of killings of young Black men. And this is it's based on true events. It's based on a show that I did in Paris called Texas in Paris in 1989, where I brought an African-American woman who had never been on an airplane and didn't have a birth certificate to Paris. She sang a cappella spirituals that she learned from her grandmother, who was 10 years old when slavery ended, and a cowboy singer who I had met through a rancher in West Texas who sang country hymns and cowboy songs. Neither were professional singers. This show, in many ways, launched a lot of my work in Europe. This show, when it was done with the real people, was 3 weeks in Paris, a week in Florence. It got major press. It was described as being the truth about Texas, the truth about America. It was the America that Europeans wanted to know more about. And that show led to several that I did. But in doing this particular show, it resonated with me very deeply because these were two gentle people who were dealing with issues related to the isolation of the worlds in which they lived. Mm-hmm. And so flash forward 25 years later, when I wrote this as musical theater, it's about these two people, Osceola Mays and John Burris, and they're brought to France by this guy from Boston who never appears in the show, and they perform on stage. They've never met before. They stay in the hotel a lot. And even when the French people are speaking to them, they can barely understand their English. So they end up having to have a conversation. And they have a conversation about race. And they butt heads. And finally, they come together. And it's very much of a powerful show. In today's world, it was powerful when we did it. It was critically a great success off Broadway. And then it was starting to tour when the pandemic came. And now there's interest in this new production. And so it's very much about these same kinds of themes, but looks at it in different ways. I've done a lot of work in radio. Both John and Osceola were people who were radio features of mine that I did for National Public Radio in the 1980s. So they also exemplify the approach that I've taken, which is very holistic. They were radio shows. They became recordings that we released through documentary arts. I did a film about Osceola Mays, and I did a children's book about her. It was published in 2000, called Osceola Memories of a Sharecropper's Daughter. I made an artist's book about her. So my interest in her, particularly, and commitment to her was spanned decades. Only by not being a paid executive director of documentary arts and taking a very project-centered approach, a big part of our mission is to be advocates for cultural equity. But cultural and gender equity also depend on, to really be effective, they have to be financially equitable. So when we release recordings through documentary arts, we've done about 19 releases. The performers are equal partners in the net profits. When I did a book about Osceola Mays, she was an equal partner with me in the ownership of the book. So we're not only advocates in a sense of wanting to pursue the issues, we want to be able to try to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Osceola, when she came back from Paris after 1989, was able to start the first savings account of her life. That's what matters. With Jasper, Texas, we just had our Texas premiere of that movie after 30 years of going at different times to Jasper, and we presented the community with a hard drive with 6,000 of these images that we were able to conserve for their use. So we want to create models that are viable and hopefully sustainable as we move forward.
Alan Govenar, you are a clear example of someone who creates documentaries, musicals, plays, poetry that can ripple into education, policy, and cultural awareness. Even in communities shaped by trauma, there are signs of resilience and progress, and you give people the opportunity to have a better future. As an activist, what is your hope for the future?
I'm always hoping for a better world, a more gender and culturally equitable society. And I'm a person of hope, and not always easy to sustain, but the work is very much worth doing. At the end of the day, I want to feel like maybe I've made some small difference in someone's life. And the idea of focusing on ordinary people has been a constant in my work over the years. And I think if your listeners want to find out more about what I do, they should look at our website, documentaryarts.org. There's another website you should look at called truthinphotography.org. We have another website called mastersoftraditionalarts.org, which are essentially ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the cultural preservation and creativity. And to find out more about Jasper, Texas, I would hope people would look for the book called Kinship and Community that was just published a few weeks ago by Aperture Foundation. It's edited by Nicole Fleetwood and Brian Wallace, and it's a book about the growth of the Texas African American Photography Archive. Additionally, check out some of my other books. My newest novel, Come Round Right, is about growing up, coming of age, dealing with trauma. What do we do to find ourselves? What's necessary for us to undertake what are our responsibilities that we find in our own dreams and aspirations.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights with our audience. You know, your insights of bringing the arts and activism together, they blend beautifully. And when it's done so well, people do get the message. And I look forward to seeing your film. Thank you so much for carving out the time today to speak with me. And I want to thank my listening audience here on hmTV for listening to us today here on Ordinary Heroes at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. I'm your host, Bernie Furshpan. Until next time.